Hi everyone, and welcome to our third actually meetup on Romania Power BI and Modern Excel user group. Today we have the big honor to have Matt Allington as our featured guest. He'll be doing a session on Power Query and how it can be used with out of the box, not necessarily day-to-day usage. But before we go into the session, we should go through some housekeeping slides. We're on the first part, short part of welcome and overview now. I'll show you the next meetups in one slide, and then we go directly to the feature presentation and Q&A. Before we start, please make sure that your microphone is muted and your video is turned off during the presentation. You can type your questions or comments in the chat area, and, just to make sure we can spot easily your questions, mark them with a Q in front of them. The meeting is recorded, and actually this is a reminder for myself, but this time I managed to start the recording on time. So for whoever doesn't want to be recorded, you can drop off and see the recording afterwards. Few things on our next meetups. The next one will be on May 27, and Reza Rad will come and have a session on data flows and Power Query online. And then the June meetup will be also on Power Query, where Chandip will come and show us some very cool tips and tricks on Power Query. Now that we've gone through the short part, the beginning part, let's go back to our feature presentation today. As I said, we have the big honor to have Matt Allington as our presenter today. The session will be around 45-50 minutes, and you can type the questions in the chat during the session. To be honest, I admire Matt very, very much, and I've learned a lot from him through the years. I had the pleasure to actually meet Matt back in 2017 in Slovenia, right, Matt? And,
I thought it was later than that. It was 2019. Yeah.
19, yeah.
I think it was only 2 years ago, 2019.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I took several courses from Matt, and I'm following his blog, and I recommend you also follow his blog. He'll tell you some more about it. Matt is also the co-founder of skillwave.training, where a lot of actually the best resources in Power BI, Power Query, Power Pivot can be found there, and a lot of very good courses are there. But I'll also let Matt tell you some things about it. And Matt, it's actually the guy who made me understand DAX. So there was he has some books written on DAX. Actually, Matt just released his third edition on the Supercharged Power BI this April. And I totally recommend you buy that book if you really want to understand DAX. So thanks again, Matt, for accepting our invitation, and the stage is yours.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Christian. And so it's great to be here. And so I'm in Australia, as I'm sure you know, and it's about 7 p.m. here. So just get my screen up here. And so, yeah, so the topic for today, I call it Power Query is more than just an ETL tool. And it looks like you're going to be having a bit of Power Query content in the coming weeks, but that's great. It's one of the fantastic pieces of software that's out there, and there are so many things that you can do with it. And so this presentation is really just to perhaps create awareness of some of the things that maybe you didn't know Power Query can do. Hopefully there's at least one or two things in here that you weren't aware of. So that's my objective for this session. Christian's already done a great job at introducing me. My background before I did this for a living was that I used to work at Coca-Cola, and I spent time in sales, and I also spent 10 years in IT. I did Coca-Cola for 25 years, and I've been doing this now for 7 years. I've been working with these products. This is the book that Christian mentioned. The black one down here is the 3rd edition of my book. This is a DAX book. If you want to learn DAX, I've spent a lot of time refining the content, and people tell me that it's a good book, and so yeah, you can find out more about that on my website. Okay, so let's talk about the session today. So as I said, I want to introduce and cover some things that are a little bit perhaps different, certainly not your regular concept of loading data into Power BI. So I have 4 demos that I have prepared. We'll see how we go for time. But yeah, certainly 4 demos. So the first one, I'm going to load some data directly into a pivot table, and I'll go through the details as we go. Secondly, I'm going to get some data, and I'm going to use Excel to add some commentary against that data. So I'm going to use a bank statement scenario there. And then the third one, I'll show you some auditing where I perhaps would have used Microsoft Access in the past. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how to deal with large files and do some manipulation to extract large files, again, so more than 1 million rows. So as I said, hopefully there's something here that you haven't seen before. Okay, so let me start off with this one. So I'm going to show you how you can use Power Query to directly query a data source, and then instead of loading the data into the Power Pivot data model, or instead of loading the data into a table in Excel, I'm going to load it directly into a pivot table. And in fact, this process has changed a little bit since the first time I did this presentation. So it's actually pretty straightforward now, but it's more just about creating awareness of that. So you connect to the data, you do any preparation work that you would need to do, and then you can load your pivot table, and you keep a copy of the data in the pivot cache is the technical location for that within Excel. So let me jump into the demo, and I've got this is just a blank workbook at the moment, and I'm also going to bring Windows Explorer down and just show you the data that I'm going to be using. So I've got 2 tables here. These are AdventureWorks tables. So this is actually the sales table as a CSV. I'll just quickly open it so that you can get a sense of what's in it. If you've seen any of my material, I use AdventureWorks pretty much exclusively. This version has been updated to be more recent than the original AdventureWorks. And this table is 60,000 rows, and so I won't save that. And so I've got these two tables here. Okay, so I'm going to come into my blank pivot table, my blank workbook, and I'm going to go to data. So you would all know that this is, I should just let me get my screen pointer working. I think I worked out how to do this. So if I change screen sizes, let me try that again. That's still not working. All right, it's going to be a bit awkward for me to draw on my screen. So let me come into Excel. So you'll all know that the data tab, this section here is Power Query. I think it's very poorly labeled. I would love to see a Power Query submenu here. I think that would be very good for the overall product, but unfortunately it's not the way it works. So I'm just going to get data from a CSV file. I need to import both of these CSV files, and I'll just come up to my sample data here. I'll import the sales data first. You may have noticed the file size here, 6.3 meg, and the products is very small. And I'm just going to go, I think I can just go transform data actually. So I'll just go straight into Power Query with this. And I'll expand my query here. So here's my sales table. Now I want to go and fetch the products table as well. So I'll just right click new query from CSV and grab the products table. I'm sure you're aware that the Excel use of Power Query is a little bit harder to control how the data gets loaded. You don't get as much flexibility. Inside Power BI Desktop, I could right click here and make a choice whether this data gets loaded or not. But you can't do that so easily within Power Query for Excel. So I'm just going to flatten this out. So this is more of a traditional star schema. I've got a sales fact table and I've got a products dimension table. But in this case, because I'm loading the data directly into the pivot cache, I'm not loading it into the Power Pivot data model. And so I need to denormalize the data. I need to join it back into one single flat table. And so to do that, I'm just coming up to the sales table and then I'll merge queries. I can either merge it as new or I can merge it within this one query. And I'm going to join it on the product key. And then I'll click OK. And then I'm just going to come up here and extract the rest of the data that I want, which I've just, I mean, one of the advantages of Power Query, of course, is that you don't have to load everything that you don't want. So maybe I'll just get rid of a few of these things and just load a few of those product columns. And so now I've flattened this table out, so it's denormalized. And now I'm going to go close and load 2. And at this stage, I'm not going to add it to the data model, so I won't select that, and I'll only select create connection. So I now have my query. It will appear here in a moment, no doubt. Now, I actually had a few problems with this today. I didn't think the UI was working that well, and I don't see my query. So let me just see what's going on.
Is it an insider version?
No, it's not. Could have been. I did have a problem with this. I was just doing a run through before earlier on this afternoon, and I did have a few problems with the UI. So let me just try this again. It's going to be we've got plenty of time for questions if the demos don't work, that's for sure. All right, so let's enable content, pop out the query pane. Okay, there they are, so a bit strange. All right, so now the point I wanted to make at this stage is if you have a look at this file, this one here, 1A Direct to Power Pivot, notice this file is 22 kilobytes. So I've created the queries. The queries exist in the workbook, but they're just not loaded, but all the transformations are loaded. If we have I'll go back now, and what I'll do is I'll right click on this connection and select load to, and now I've got this other option. I have to remember to stop doing this because I can't zoom in properly. So I've got these other options which are seldom used. Now, if I select table, it's going to load those 60,000 rows with all the columns, and it's going to blow out the size of my workbook. I can also, but this is the one that I was going to show you, is that you can come in here and create a pivot table. So I'll put this in this corner of the worksheet, and now the query will run. Data has been loaded, and let me go ahead and just build out a quick pivot table here so I can bring in category and maybe color, and I'll go and grab the sales amount and build a pivot table. Now I'm just going to save this again, and let's go back and have a comparison or look at the file sizes. So now that you can see that this table, or this workbook, is 1.8 meg in size, but if I come up to the source data, the source data was about 6.4 megabytes in size. And so the couple of things that I want you to take away from this, one is that you don't have to load it to the data model, you don't have to load it to a table, you can load it directly into a pivot table. And when you do that, the data gets compressed and loaded into what's called the pivot cache. And then you can build your data models from your pivot tables from there without having to basically load the data in uncompressed format. Now, I'm not saying you should do this. I'm just saying it's an interesting use case that is not immediately obvious. All right, so let me jump back to my notes, and we'll jump back to my slides, and I'll go on to the second demo. So this one I call self-referencing tables, and the use case that I'm going to show you here is I'm going to download some sample bank statements where there are some transactions. They've got transaction IDs, and I've got a date and a description that perhaps comes from the bank. But what I want to do is I want to add some of my own comments to the data. And I'll show you the problem with doing this using the standard way that you might think would work. And then I'm going to show you a little trick, what I call self-referencing tables, on how to make this process work pretty smoothly and end-to-end. So that's the second demo. So let me jump over here. I'll close down these as we go so I don't get confused. And here is my bank statements. I'll jump here. So here is a transactions table. So I'm sorry, a transactions folder. Now in this transactions folder, I've just got 3 CSV files. I'm simulating that I downloaded these from my bank. And if we jump in here, so this is 2020, November 2020. And if I just open that file so you can see what it looks like, you can see I'll just expand this a little bit. So this is a pretty typical bank transaction where I've got a date, a description, and a debit and a credit column. So I'm going to need to tidy these columns up, which I'll also do. But there's one very important thing that I must call out at this stage is that you must have a unique transaction ID or a primary key on these transaction files. Otherwise, what I'm going to show you will not work. And if you don't have one, you could create one in these source files, but it must be unique across the entire set of data that you're going to load. Otherwise, this technique doesn't work. All right, so I won't save that, and I'll come back in here and we'll go get data. And this time, because I'm trying to combine the data from multiple CSV files, I'm not going to select this option, but instead I'll say get data from file from folder. And when I take this option, Power Query allows me to select a folder from the menu. So I'll come up here, go into the transactions folder, and I'll click open. And then Power Query will inspect the contents of that folder, and it found 3 files. And this process used to be a lot harder, but it's actually pretty straightforward now because Power Query has evolved. And so now I'm going to combine these files and transform the data. So by saying combine and transform, I get the opportunity to interact with the data before I load it into my workbook. Now, you may or may not have seen this file combine wizard before. The way I like to describe this wizard is that this box here says, tell me which file you want me to load. And so the way the wizard works is it says, give me a file, teach me how to process a single file, and after I've learned how to do a single file, then I'll repeat the process for every file I find in the folder. So that's the concept of how this wizard works. And so we're saying just use the first file. I don't care what it is. I always recommend just using the first file. This process only ever works if all your files are of the same data structure anyway, so there's no reason why you should necessarily hard code and pick one of those files by name. The trouble if you pick one of those files by name is if you later on delete that file, your query will fail. So I'm going to take the first file, and here's a sample. I'll just click OK. And the wizard's doing its thing now, and so you can see quite a lot of activity over here. These queries are all forms of queries are quite complex, but there's only really 2 things you need to understand with this. and that's this one here, transform sample file. So remember what I said before is teach me how to deal with a single file, and then I'll repeat the process for every file that I find. So this is the single file query, and this is the one that repeats the process for every single file that it finds. In this case, it's the 3 files. So I generally recommend, if you need to make changes to this query, you should aim to make changes here. Teach Power Query how to deal with a single file the way that you want to do that. And so if you look here, I've got my I've got these 2 columns, and they're both text. So I'm going to change both of these to I'll transform them. I'll just do a detect data type, and that will change them to decimal. Now I want to get rid of these 2 columns. I'd like to have a positive number if it's a debit and a negative number if it's a credit. Now, if you may know this already, but I'll just show you. If I add column, custom column, and I say, give me the debits and subtract the credits, when I do that, I end up with all nulls. And this is a little nuance of Power Query, and that is that if you do a mathematical transaction on a null value, you're going to return a null regardless. So 6.68 minus null is not 6.68, it's actually null. And so there's a few different ways you can do this. I could change this formula. I could say, I might do it this way. I could say if debit equals null, then give me minus credit, else give me debit. That would be one way of writing that column differently. Another way you could do it is you could replace all the nulls with zeros, and then the mathematical transaction would work. Now, if you don't already have your formula bar visible, you should definitely turn on the formula bar inside Power Query. You can do that from the View menu up here, Formula Bar. And it just means that you can see what's going on under the hood, and that makes it a lot easier to maintain and debug your formulas. And you'll get better at using Power Query if you do that. So I'm going to remove those columns, and I'll detect the data type. Actually, I'll just change it to this, and I might give it a name. And so let's just rename. Now notice, what did I do? I added the custom step here. All right, I'm just going to rename this. I'm going to call it amount. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll go File, Close and Load to. And I'll load it. This time I am going to load it to a table because I do want the data in a table in my spreadsheet. All right, so what did I do wrong there? I'm not sure. So once same again. So let's see if I can. It's a bit annoying. It didn't ask me to save that either, so that's very annoying. Bank statement 29,654. It may have saved it. I'm not using the Insider Edition. It's not. I prefer just to have something a little bit more stable. But I did observe some problems earlier on today. All right, so there they all are. Go figure. So let's just try and refresh that and see what happens. All right, doesn't like my. So let's go back and have a look. I changed my formula from what I did during the previous session, so maybe that's what's happened. This is actually a pretty common thing that will happen in Power Query, and one of the things that you do need to learn to do is what do you do when you come up against an error message? And so what I normally do is I start at the query and then I try and work my way back through the query until I find the point of failure. So when I'm down here, I've got an error message, so I sort of work my way back. Just keep working your way upstream, looking for the issue. Now I can see the error appearing here, and I come back, and so I can see the error appearing here. So the column debit of the table wasn't found. So why is that? So it's in the file 2012. I don't actually know what the issue is. I did run it earlier on today, so I'm just going to take that file out. rather than try and debug that formula, let's just try refresh. Okay, notice that I've refreshed. The error is no longer there, but this little error bar here is still indicating there's an error, but that's just a little bug. So we'll just go close and load. I'll refresh. Oh, it's the change in this change type steps. I'll get rid of that. And that's also very common, that when you use the wizard and you have the change type step, if you remove those columns, then that also becomes a problem. All right, so let's just do a detect data type, and I'm going to get rid of this file name, and we'll go ahead and load that up. That actually might have been the issue all along, I'm not sure. All right, so here's my data. I don't know why that's not a table. That concerns me a little bit. Let's just go back and do it again, because that should have been an Excel table and it looked like it was. There we go. So now we've got an Excel table. All right, so let me show you the problem. So what I want to do is I want to add some comments. So I'm going to come here and add comments, and you can see that the table's been expanded. And so this is Apple iTunes, so this might have been, you know, Dylan song that I purchased, and this was my shopping at Coles, and this was some steak that I bought from the butcher. So the whole point is I can add comments to this table. Okay, but here's the problem. What happens if the structured data, the data in here changes? And so I'm going to come back into this query, so right click and edit the query, and I'm deliberately going to change the structure of this table or the data before I load it. So not the table, but the data. So I'm going to load, I'm going to sort this description column, and I'll see if I can get this up here. And take note, so the Apple iTunes was Bob Dylan, Coles was shopping, butcher was steak, and now if I go close and load, notice that all this data changed, but the data in the new column that I added did not change. And so while this comment column looks like it's an addition to the table, it's actually not part of the table at all. It's sitting alongside the table with the same coloration, but the data is not joined at the rows. And so if you do this, you definitely will be in trouble, because if your data changes, your comments are going to be against the wrong items, and that will be a big problem. So I'm going to come back and unsort that row, and then I'll show you a way that you can solve this problem. All right, so we're back to normal. So the trick is, and this is why I call this self-referencing tables. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to load this table back into Power Query. So this is a second copy of the table, but this copy has the comments attached. So I'll click in the table and go data from table range. And I don't know what happened to the UI here, because this was much larger earlier on, so I'm sorry about that. It's a little bit hard to see, I'm sure. And so now I've got a second copy. So here's my transactions table, and here's my second copy of the transaction table, including the comments. And so I'm going to rename this comments, and I'm going to come to this original transaction table, and I'm going to join it to the new table. So I'll come up to the original transaction, and I'll go merge queries, merge it with my comments table. Oh man, what is going on here? Try again.
Shift plus will increase the size, Matt.
Shift plus?
Control Shift plus will increase the size of the entire Power Query editor.
There we go. Wow, see, everyone's learning. Thanks a lot, Christian. I don't know why this merge query is not working. So see how I can't click this box. This is really, just let me shut this and I'll go back in again. So it's been very flaky. So edit. Interesting, it zoomed down again. All right, so let's try again. Transactions.
There's a lag also on the video. Maybe if you unshare and share again the screen, this would fix it.
Okay. I'm having real problems with Power Query because it's not.
I think it's Teams for the lag problem.
Could be. Could be the lag problem, but the problem I've got is that this Power Query is not working. So I should be able to merge and select my comments table, but it's not letting me. All right, just give me a second. Demo gods are not being nice. I'm just going to shut down the file. And restart it. I don't know if anyone else has noticed that Power Query is being flaky.
Yeah, actually, there was a question at the beginning. What Excel are you using? What version of Excel? 365.
I think it's Office 365 Excel 2016. I think it's about April 21, so fairly new. So merge queries. Yeah, I know it's small, but I just want to try and. Oh my. I wonder if I've got one that I have prepared earlier. This is, unfortunately, I would do it in Power BI Desktop, which is more robust, but unfortunately, this particular demo requires Excel because I'm making changes in Excel, and it's not something that I can do in.
Yeah,
just let me check my recycle bin and see.
Close the Excel process from Task Manager. Just make sure you're starting fresh.
I don't know. It's just simply not working. All right. So what you would normally do is I would connect to the comments table, and then extract the comments as an additional column in this screen. Now, when I extract it as an additional column, it actually gets a new name. It comes out with comments.1, and I actually rename it to be comments. I want it to have exactly the same name as it has here in this comments table, right? So it's got to be worded exactly like this. So even though Power Query calls it comments.1, I rename it to comments, and then do a close and load. And after doing that, what will happen is an additional comment, additional column will come in called comments2. So it comes up like this, and the data will be replicated in this column here like that. And so it seems like I've doubled up, and in fact I have doubled up the data, and then all you need to do is click on this column and delete it. So once you delete that additional comments column, that's it. It just works from then on. So I can go ahead and add additional comments anywhere along the line. It doesn't matter if the query is sorted in a different order or anything else happens. These comments have now been joined based on this transaction ID, which is the way I would have joined it if it was applying properly, and it just works. So I'm sorry about that, Christian. What I might do is I'll see if I can record that again when I get this my version of Excel working, and we'll work out. I'll share that with you.
I can testify that this works.
So yeah,
this works for sure because I tried it, and I went further and it used the same technique based on your idea, but not with merging, but with appending some new data. So if you have a snapshot from website or something like this, and you get only the snapshot, you can append it to itself, and you can have a kind of history using the same technique.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Celia had a
All right.
great
Look,
suggestion.
I'm going to switch.
Maybe you can reboot, and we wait for you for 2 minutes. If you think it's
yeah.
helpful.
Look, I think let me move on to the next one. I'm going to switch over to Power BI Desktop, and let's see how we're going at the end. I mean, I think it would take me longer than 2 minutes to reboot. So, but I've lost faith now, so I'm going to switch over to Power BI Desktop. Okay, so the third example is something that perhaps you haven't thought about before, and that is I'm going to use Power Query as a matching tool. So here I've got like an accounts receivable list. So this is a list of invoices that a company, AdventureWorks in this case, may have. So this is a list of invoices that has been sent out to a customer. The customer has got many stores that that buy under the same banner. And here are the invoice numbers, and this is how much we're expecting them to pay. So it's like the end of month accounts receivable list. And then I have a second file, which is the remittance advice. So the customer has taken, and the customer has paid a number of invoices, and they've provided a remittance advice, including the invoice number and how much money they paid. But the problem is, of course, we don't know which invoices did they pay, which ones didn't they pay. Did they pay in full? Did they overpay? Did they underpay? There's lots of questions that need to be answered in order to do proper transactional mapping here. And so traditionally, back in the day when I was doing work, I would have done this in Access. I would have loaded my data in Access. I would have written queries to do those joins, and that's the way I would have done it. But now you can do it in Power Query. And so I'm going to use Power BI Desktop, and I'll get data from Excel. I do need to navigate to the folder. I need to load each of these files separately. So I'll click to the accounts receivable, and it makes the connection. In this case, because I'm connecting directly to an Excel file, I just have to point to the sheet or the table. In this case, there's a sheet, and I'll go transform data. That will fire up the Power Query editor, which is up here. And before I do anything else, I'm going to rename this. This is the accounts receivable. I like to use no spaces in my query names if I can. It just tidies up the code a little bit. So that's right, accounts receivable. Okay, so now I'm going to right click and do a new query from Excel, and I'll bring in the remittance advice. And this one's also called sheet 3. That's because I created the test data myself. And then this will be the remittance. So it's important to rename these queries so that you know what they are. Now, I mentioned before that the UI was not quite as good in Excel, so I can right click and just disable the load on these queries one at a time. We can't do that in Power Query for Excel, which is a bit of a shame. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to do some joins using the tools that we've got, and I'm going to build an audit query effectively. So I'm going to start with the accounts receivable, and that's important because it's the book of record. This is our master data, or the company master data. That is the book of record. What our customer sent back is basically what they chose to do, but that's definitely not the book of record. So starting here, I'm going to do a merge query as a new query, and I'm going to join the accounts receivable to the remittance, and I'm going to join on the invoice number. Now, if necessary, I could join on more than one column, so 2 or more columns, and in this case the invoice numbers are unique, so it's fine. But if I do want to join on the date as well, I could hold the control key down and click on the invoice date, and then notice that you get these little 1s and 2s telling you. So this is a multi-column join. You can do it in Power Query. It's not so easy to do inside DAX or so. All right, so I don't really want to do that. So let's see if I don't think it'll hurt. I might just I don't want to have any more faux pas, so I'm just going to do it again the way I did it before, so in case I get unexpected behavior. All right, so now I've created a new query, and I'll call this my audit data. And at this stage, I'm going to extract the columns that I need. I just need to extract the payment amount, and this time I'm going to keep the column name prefix. This will just help me identify the difference between this payment amount column, which came from my from the accounts receivable, and this payment column. And so this is actually the expected amount, and this is the actual paid. Just giving them good, meaningful names makes everything easier. Now, notice that I can see this little black line here. So this feature is called column profile, is it? Column quality. Now, some of these features, I think this one's on permanently now that I think about it. Yeah, so, and I could turn on column quality, and this tells me numerically what this little bar chart is telling me. And so there's 2% of this column is empty, and so I can tell that nothing in this column is empty. So what I'm going to do before I move on here is I'm just going to replace those nulls with transform replace values, and I'm going to replace the nulls with 0 because that'll help me do the comparisons. And as I mentioned before, if you subtract a null, you'll get a null. Now, importantly, when I'm referring to the null keyword, it must be lowercase. So find null and replace it with 0. And that sorts out that, and now I don't have any empty cells. All right, so at this stage, I can now start to do some rules. I can build some rules on my data, because if I expected 756.33 and I received 756.33, then obviously there's no problem with that particular invoice. So I'm going to add a column, and I'm going to use this conditional column feature. It's very powerful, and it's been improved several times over the years. Excuse me. And so we'll call this the variance or status. Just give me a second. Excuse me. All right, so now I'm going to say that if the expected amount is equal to the column actual paid, then by definition it's paid in full. And then I can add as many additional clauses as I need. So I'll add a clause and I'll say if the actual paid is less than the column expected amount. So if they pay less than I expect, then they short paid. And I could say another clause, I could say if the actual paid is greater than the column expected, then they overpaid. I guess that doesn't happen too often, but we should build that use case. And we'll click OK. So let's have a look at this. So you can see here I've got some different values: paid in full, short paid. No one's overpaid, as predicted. Sorry, just got a itchy throat here. So let's have a look at these. So the paid in full, they're fine. Let's just go and have a look at the short paid. And notice here now that this one is definitely short paid. I was expecting 2,400, got 2,200. But now that I think about it, the second one is not really short paid. The second one was not paid. I mean, there's a difference between short paid and not paid. And so technically speaking, if they haven't paid anything, it's a not paid. And so I'm going to remove that filter and come back in. Anytime you want to edit these steps, you click on the cog and the wizard comes back up. So I need to add a clause that says if the actual paid equals 0, This time I'm not selecting a column, but I'm entering my own value. If actual paid equals 0, then it's not paid. Now, another thing that you need to be aware of with this conditional column is that it works its way from the top to the bottom, and it stops after it finds the first match. And so you can see here that this short paid rule gets applied before the not paid rule, and that's not going to work. So I need to move this up and make sure that the not paid rule, where it evaluates against 0, gets executed first. So then I'll click OK. And so now we've got 3 different values, so that's all good. I'll change this to text, and I'm going to add one more column where I actually pull in the variance, because that would be helpful in the process of doing the debt collection. So I'm going to add a column, and this time I'll just do a custom column, and I'll take the actual paid and subtract the expected amount. I always have to check that I'm doing this the right way around, but if we paid 8 and we expected 10, then it's going to be -2. And if they short paid, then we definitely want a minus number. So that's correct. I should have named that column when I was here. I should have named it, but I accidentally hit OK. But this is another reason I like this little formula bar at the top, because if you look at this formula bar, you can sort of see that this custom has been hard coded. It's almost like it's the default name. And so I'm just going to come up here and call this the variance. And as long as you're careful, you can certainly make those types of changes without having to go back into these cogs. And I need to set that to be a decimal number. Probably should have done it as a that one there. All right, so that's it. So now I can go File, Close, and Apply. I've written my query, and I'll just go ahead and let that load. And now I can build a tool that will allow me to manage the process of collection of money. And so I'm going to add a slicer. Now this has also been a little bit like this recently, where there's a bit of a lag after the data loads before you can actually interact with the report. And now I've got 2 of them. I'm sure Teams is not helping either. So I can bring the status into a slicer, and I could bring a table in with the invoice number, the expected amount, the actual paid, and the variance. And then if my job is following up money, I can come in and say, show me the short paid invoices, and there they are. And telling me the variance, I can bring in the customer number as well if necessary. And then show me the ones that were not paid as well. And these ones haven't been paid at all. So at the end of the month, when you get some new transactional data, as long as the 2 files have the same name, if I drop the 2 new files for the new month into this same folder and make sure they've got the same name, all I need to do is come here and hit refresh, and the report will automatically update for me for the latest set of data. And there's other tips and tricks that you can use around that. All right, I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to just quickly jump into this last demo without going into too much on the slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that you can use Power Query to export data to open large files. In this case, I'm going to open a CSV file with 3 million rows, and I'm going to manipulate that data and then create a new CSV file with 1 million rows. I'm going to do it in Power BI Desktop. I wanted to show you this in Excel, but I have low faith now, so I'm not going to do that. So I'll just open a new workbook. The reason I was going to show you this in Power Query for Excel is you probably know that if you try and open an Excel, a CSV in Excel, it's got a 1 million row limit. So you can't open a CSV file that's got 3 million rows inside Excel. But what you can do is you can use Power Query and load it to the Power Pivot data model. And so I'm effectively doing that, but I'm doing it inside Power BI Desktop instead. So I'll show you the file. So here it is. I won't open it. Believe me, it's got 3 million rows in it, and it's got some sales transactions in there. So I'll get data from CSV and open this file. There are some other tools out there that you can use to manage very large files, but in a way what we're doing here is we're using Power Query and Power Pivot or the Power BI engine to load the data into a database, which is actually a reporting database, then using the power of Power Query to basically create a subset of the data. So I'm going to transform the data. I don't want all 3 million rows. I actually only want the rows for 2016. So I can use Power Query. I can add a column. I can add a year column. And then once I've got that column, I need to go load more, because you'd be aware probably Power Query only previews the data. So it's only about 1,000 rows of data. So I need to click on load more before I can see the list of values that I can select from. I could have come here and hard coded the number filter. That would have also been fine. All right, so give me 2016. And now that I've put that filter, I can remove that column again because I don't need the additional column. And I'll just go File, Close and Apply. I'll let that run. And so without opening the 3 million row CSV file, I've been able to select a subset of the rows, about the 1.3 million rows that belong in the year 2016, and I'm loading a copy of those rows into Power BI Desktop. It would also work if I added it to the data model in Excel and loaded it into Power Pivot. So that takes a moment to load. Now inside inside Excel, if you've got DAX Studio loaded, there is now, you can just click on the DAX Studio launch button from within Excel, and more recently you can do the same in Power BI Desktop. I've got articles on DAX Studio on my website if you're interested. So I'm going to fire up DAX Studio, and it's on the other screen. And so when I fire up DAX Studio, I've automatically got a connection to that table, and I'm just going to go evaluate and bring the name of the table across and set the output to be a file. And when I run that query, it asks me what's the name of the file, and I'll call this 2016 data. And if you notice down the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, you can see DAX Studio cycling through that table and writing those records through to the CSV file. And that will take a moment, and when it finishes, it's about 1.3 million records. So just conscious of time, I'm going to just leave it there and throw up my final slide, which is, yes, you can ask me anything with the small amount of time that I've got left. So sorry for my problems with that demo. Christian mentioned earlier on that I have this joint venture with Ken Pools and Miguel Escobar. So I would like to offer everyone a 20% discount if you'd like to learn some more about Power Query. So you can use this QR code. You'll need to know this coupon, Romania Pug, and that will give you 20% discount on any of the products that we have for sale at SkillWave. This one's free, so I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't go and have a look at Power Query Academy Fundamentals. And this one's normally $350 US, so you got what, $70 off of that if you'd like to do that. So Christian, with the short amount of time that we've got left, any questions from anyone there?
No, not very specific. Maybe now, do you recommend, one question from Florin, do you recommend using data flows or not?
It's a good question. So I personally don't use data flows a lot, but that sometimes has got to do with your situation. What I know about data flows is that Microsoft is investing most of the new money in data flows. And the work that they're doing in data flows will come into Power BI Desktop and then eventually come into Power Query for Excel. But the new work is happening in data flows. You may have seen the merge queries user interface in data flows, where it gives you a nice visual representation of how those merges work. So I really like that. So look, I think it's a great tool, and if it meets your requirements, it makes a lot of sense to do it. Probably the main time that I would consider doing it would be if I have different queries that I need to refresh at a different cycle. So one of the features of Power BI Desktop is when you hit refresh, it automatically refreshes everything, whether you need it or not. One of the benefits of data flows is that you can set the refresh on the individual queries to a cycle that makes sense. And then when you still have to refresh it again to bring it into Power BI Desktop, but you can lessen the load back to the back end by changing the refresh cycle in data flows. So yeah, that's the best I can say.
Yeah, another question is from me actually. Have you ever tried to build your model and do the entire Power Query thing in Excel, upload it to Power BI, and then use it back, but as a free Power BI user, not a pro? Do you know if it's possible to use Power BI service with Analyze in Excel?
So you want the Analyze in Excel to interact live online through the browser? Is that what you mean?
No, I was thinking to build your data model with Power Query in Excel, publish the workbook in Power BI service, but as a free user, and then come back in Excel and analyze it. Not sure if it's possible because I have the Pro. I never tried it.
I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware of it being possible. So I know when you upload an Excel file, you have a choice. You either load it as a static Excel file, or you actually import it and it becomes a Power BI data set. I'm not sure what would happen if it actually had a Power Pivot data set in it. I couldn't say. I don't know if you noticed, but Microsoft has recently announced that there's a second behavior, and that is, so if you're using Analyze in Excel against a Power BI data set, so you've got a thin Power Pivot workbook or a thin pivot table workbook, they've started work on the feature that you'll be able to publish that thin workbook to powerbi.com, and it will work, the live interaction will work with Analyze in Excel. So that currently doesn't work. It used to work back in 2014 when I was still at Coca-Cola, and we had SharePoint Enterprise. We could create Power Pivot data models and load them to SharePoint Enterprise, and they would work online. But it hasn't worked since Power BI has been around. So.
Any other questions, if there are from the audience? Because otherwise we are 1 hour top, and we should.
And I do have to go. But Christian, what I might do is I might record a video of the comments, and I'll post it up on my website or into my YouTube channel, and then I'll send you a link, and you could distribute it to the users.
Thank you very much, and thanks again for taking the time to come and show us some out-of-the-box usage of Power Query. Thank you everybody for joining, and looking forward to our next meetup.
Yeah, thank you. So good luck. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. I hope everyone learned something. Thank you.
We did, for sure. Thank you. Thanks again, Matt.